Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the greatest NZ live political podcast in the world, The Working Group. Hosted by beloved left-wing broadcaster Comrade Bomber Bradbury, with the best political panel in New Zealand media, reviewing the week, setting the agenda, avoiding defamation. The Working Group is brought to you by Gravity Credit Management. When the weight of capitalism is becoming the event horizon of an imploding black hole, call 0800 Gravity, and our team will get blood out of a stone. That's 0800 Gravity. This is The Working Group.
Kia ora Aotearoa, I'm your host, the editor of the daily blog, Martin Bradbury. Hashtag socialism, hashtag solidarity, hashtag Chippy's doing his best, I suppose. This is The Working Group, New Zealand's best and greatest weekly political podcast that isn't funded by New Zealand On Air. Tonight, we are coming to you live on Sky 83, Rover, the Wātea Media Network, Māori TV, Radio New Zealand, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok for the Mokapunas, and the New Zealand Herald for the oldies. Joining me to discuss the big issues on our super duper iwi versus Pee-wee treaty debate special is the greatest political panel in New Zealand broadcasting history. Our first panelist is so right-wing, he believes marriage is between a man and his property. He's the only columnist in New Zealand with an active petition on Action Station begging he's put behind a paywall, the libertarian liquidator, the Cthulhu of capitalism, the 17th most humorous white cis male columnist without a pronoun at stuff. Damien, all tax is theft. Grant, kia ora, comrade, welcome back to the show. One word to describe the week, please, sir.
Gratitudes. I've been chipping in bits of money to the ACT Party for going on 2 decades now, and you know that meme where the guy goes to the counter and the 2 guys behind, and he's asking for something, round the world cruise, and the guy behind the counter says, "Best I can do is a half-price ticket to Waiheke Island." Well, this is how I feel with ACT. I wanted heroin to be legalised. I wanted the Department of Education to be scrapped, and I wanted the medical profession to be completely deregulated. And all David Seymour can say is, "Best I can do is pseudoephedrine." Well, on the weekend I bought some pseudoephedrine, and I was enormously grateful. It's great. I'm dosed up on it now. So my word of the week is gratitude.
Our next panellist boldly challenged ACT to debate the treaty anytime, anywhere, and any place. And to everyone's surprise, especially ours, ACT said, "Sure, let's do it on the Working Group Political Podcast." He's as confused as we are. Standing for the treaty tonight, he's the Māori for all seasons. He has the fire of Honeheke, the dulcet tones of Sir Howard Morrison, and he is proof positive that House of Gryffindor is Māori. The mighty iwi CEO Helmut Modlik. Kia ora, comrade, welcome to the show.
Tēnā koe, Bomber. Good to be with you all tonight.
One word to describe the week, please, sir.
Inspiring. I've been inundated with thoughts and impressions and information that's just left me pumping and ready to go tonight.
And last, but certainly not least, his twerking has been designated as a hate crime against movement. He dances like a white man trapped in a burning banjo. Quite frankly, anyone with that little amount of bass in their twerk has no business commentating on race relations. Standing against the treaty tonight, he's the Māori for no reasons, leader of the ACT Party, and my electorate MP who helped me with my case against the cops when they breached my civil rights. Socialist and libertarian fighting together against the Jake Boot of the filthy police state. That was the one good thing you've ever done. Everything else has been dreadful. Ladies and gentlemen, the one, the only Voldemort. I mean, David Seymour. Kia ora, comrade. One word to describe the week, please, sir.
Well, it's worth coming just for the intro, and to all my neighbours in the Epsom electorate, we're always there to help you, as even my socialist tormentor will admit. Look, my word would be equality, because tonight we're talking about why equal rights are so important, not just in New Zealand, but in any society that wants people to be able to solve their problems, work through their differences, and actually get to a better place tomorrow than they were yesterday. And so equal rights, that's what I'm thinking about and talking about tonight, and that's what the Treaty Principles Bill is all about.
Okay, comrades, let's get into this evening's rules. Both David and Helmut have a 3-minute opening statement on what the treaty means to them and its place in New Zealand. Then the debate will move to a revolving quick-fire question panel segment, which Damien Grant will join. And at the end, David, Helmut and myself will each have a 2-minute final word. Damien will have a 1-minute final word because no one should be forced to listen to a libertarian longer than 60 seconds. Those are the rules, but...
You're giving me 3 minutes.
But
not
because...
a real libertarian.
Yeah, obviously. That's right. That's the reason. That's the reason. You're not a real libertarian.
You haven't decriminalised heroin.
But because those are the rules... But because I am Pākehā...
You haven't donated enough.
Because I am Pākehā, remember, I can change the rules at any time in a way that benefits me and then get grumpy when everyone calls me a racist. Welcome to the working group. Jump on in. Let's kick things off tonight with David Seymour's opening statement. What does the treaty mean to you and its place in New Zealand? You have 3 minutes starting now.
Look, it's a beautiful document. It is the foundation of our country. And if it was just left at that, I think would be in a very good place. If you actually look at it, it says the government has the right to govern. That everybody's basic rights will be protected. They're not just their property, but their
debatable.
All of their rights to live as they'd like to live. And that everyone has the same rights and duties.
Correct.
You can read it in a page. It's a fabulous piece of work.
Also
But
correct.
we've got a problem, which is that over the past 50 years, since Parliament said that there was such thing as treaty principles, and that's how we should view it, that's the lens through which we should see the treaty from the present day, Parliament forgot to do something. It forgot to say what those principles actually are, and into that void has rushed, jurists from the courts, the Waitangi Tribunal, whose job it is to define the principles, but doesn't want to have this bill, despite not having done it themselves for 50 years. You've seen the public service, you've seen the academics, you've seen a relatively small group of New Zealanders have come up with an idea of what Parliament meant by the principles, and the problem is that that definition says that there's a partnership between races. That means that we are seen primarily as a race rather than as human beings with equal rights in this country. And the result of that is that all sorts of other things that we need to be able to solve, like how do we build more houses for the next generation? How do we consent and build and fund the infrastructure to connect those houses together and connect them to jobs and opportunity? Come to that. How do we grow the economy? How do we ensure that people get along to school and get an education? Has been distracted and sidelined by this constant obsession with division under the so-called principles of the treaty. They've said that it's a partnership between races and therefore there had to be a separate Māori health authority. 3 Waters had to be co-governed. That if you have a public department, there might be a Māori CEO and a non-Māori CEO. That you can have infrastructure projects held up by the need to consult local iwi. And on it goes. So many of the problems that we need to solve together, we actually can't do because of this divisive interpretation of the treaty that Parliament left open to a small group of people to have a say that is different from how most New Zealanders would like to live and believe. The Treaty Principles Bill is the solution to that problem. It says that the treaty means what it says and says what it means. Government has the right to govern, everyone has their basic rights protected, and everyone has the same rights and duties. And I think if Parliament was to finally answer the question it posed 50 years ago with the Treaty of Waitangi Act, that there are principles without saying what they are, then I think we could actually go forward together and solve so many of the other challenges that we face. But the challenge for people who disagree with that is simply, where in the world is a society that has succeeded by dividing people the way that this partnership between races construct seeks to divide New Zealanders?
Now, to address the key 3 things that David Seymour said in that, and it's basically about what he views as the principles, right? Which is firstly that the government has the right to govern, which is correct. That New Zealanders are all treated the same, like we're all equal under the law. We all have the same rights and duties. That is correct. But the second one he pointed out was that we all have the same protections of land and whatnot. See, this is something that in the Treaty Principles Bill, when it was first announced, people took a lot of issue with, myself included, primarily because I knew it could be a bit of a thorn in the side of the campaign of actually getting it across the line, because I see the merit of the actual bill itself. So what has recently happened is they've revised that slightly. They've kept the original wording to some degree like that, but they've also added another section, particularly on their website, where it's being very, very clear that Māori retain the protections as outlined in the treaty specifically, and that itself is consistent with Article 2, whereas what he just said there technically is and is not at the same time. Because whilst it very much does find itself being consistent with Article 3. It's when it comes to Article 2 is speaking specifically about Māori, and we can't actually avoid that. With that being said, how we interpret Article 2 is preposterous, and how David Seymour likes to view Article 2 as being a form of protection over ownership rights and other things like that, and even at a more local government level rather than having a large sovereign right akin to the crown. That's how he views it. Whereas the other side of the equation, from the likes of Helmut Modlik, they would view that as something that is supreme and on a par with it. And so, yeah, it's a bit of a confusing little element of the Treaty Principles Bill and David Seymour's reasoning. But at the end of the day, it's far more accurate, in my opinion, than what the other side of the equation would have us believe.
Thank you, David. Helmut, I'll ask you now for your opening statement. What does the treaty mean to you and its place in New Zealand? You have 3 minutes, starting now.
Well, when I was a little boy, I used to enjoy reading fiction, and it was not until I grew up that I actually learned that there are actual facts in life that you have to get your head around. And so I just enjoyed listening to a recitation of the fiction of the constitutional legitimacy.
This guy is so delusional.
Sovereignty and democracy of this land. So here's my intro. 2 years ago, the protest at Parliament reminded us that democracy is a fiction only made real by the consent of the governed. It reminded us that for democracy to work, ideals like truth, fairness and justice have to be real. We were also reminded what happens when that consent is withdrawn. When citizens no longer believe that ideas like truth and justice and fairness are actually being upheld, the fiction breaks down, consent is withdrawn and chaos ensues. Now I start with those ideas, gentlemen, and those observations because truth, fairness and justice are what's at stake for us here tonight and for our nation. It is a historical fact. Listen to this. It's a historical fact that every non-Māori person, every democratic or civil institution in this land is only here because the sovereign tribes of Aotearoa and the British Empire reached agreement on the terms of their existence here in 1840. And what were those terms? Act would have us believe those rangatira in 1840 surrendered their authority to Hobson and his queen. In exchange, they were permitted to keep their lands and treasures, were granted the rights of British citizenship, and that total surrender of chiefly tribal mana and power was obtained over 100,000 fiercely independent warlike people by few officials, some missionaries, without military support or compensation. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a damn good trick to me. The actual terms were that the rangatira granted the British the right to apply British law and governance. That's actually literally what kāwanatanga means. Not sovereignty, governance.
You do not want to get me started on that one, mate.
Kāwana is a transliteration of governor. Kāwanatanga denotes the role of governance.
Now, can Mr. Helmut Modlik explain what sovereignty means? Because I think we'll find that he cannot explain what sovereignty means. He will just deflect and claim that sovereignty is how we interpret it. Obviously, he doesn't actually go into it as far as I'm aware. But the reality of the matter is sovereignty is the authority to govern. And so if you're granting someone the authority to govern in an article, which he is more or less admitting to, then you are granting that individual sovereignty, because without governance you do not have sovereignty. That's just how facts work, mate.
Not sovereignty. Governance over who? The 2,000 odd British citizens that were in this land and those that would follow.
And see, this is a myth that I really can't stand, right? It's a deliberate addition to what the treaty says, which cannot be found anywhere. And for some reason, too many people believe it to be true. And it goes like this, essentially, as he just outlined, that the governance granted by Māori over all of the lands of New Zealand only applies to British subjects, only applies to non-Māori. There is zero evidence of this anywhere in the treaty at all. Not in the preamble, not in Article 1, not in Article 2 or Article 3. In fact, Article 3 would go a long ways as to suggest that that is a complete load of nonsense. You cannot say that Article 3 gives everyone the same rights and duties under law, gives Māori the same rights and duties under law, and then say that Māori are not required to follow that law. If Māori have absolutely nothing to do with British law or Crown law that's being implemented through governance here, then they cannot possibly have the same rights and duties under law. It's just simply not how it works. Because the rights and duties bestowed upon Māori are done so through the governance, through the structure that's established, through the laws passed. Without that, absolutely nothing can happen. Absolutely nothing would be able to enforce what Article 3 says. It's a nonsensical position, not based on reality at all.
In return, the existing rights of total chiefly authority, literally what tino rangatiratanga means.
And then I'd also pull him up on that. Literally what tino rangatiratanga means. A number of people who will give you a different definition for what tino rangatiratanga means in the context of Te Tiriti will tell you that you can't really say literally. It is rather subjective. It is rather dependent on how you are trying to interpret the document. Now, you can sit there and say that is literally what it means all you like, but you'll find someone disputing that, and you'll find that in practice that's not what it meant at all, especially if you compare it with what the intended meaning was.
Over tribes and resources were guaranteed, as well as protection and rights of citizenship. That's it. Now, you don't have to be a genius to know which one of those scenarios makes more sense or is true. The good news is, though, whānau, is that our ancestors had a vision for the creating together here in this beautiful land something new, something better than they had previously enjoyed. Te Tiriti still holds that promise for us today. Respectful coexistence of kāwanatanga and rangatiratanga, as outlined in Te Tiriti, has already been agreed. The only way forward for us is, if truth and justice are to be involved, is with the retention of that coexistence. Tonight we've got to answer two key questions, whānau. First, what did Te Tiriti o Waitangi mean to its signatories in 1840? We've got to answer that. We've got to nail that. And second, what does it mean to us today and to our moko tomorrow? The eyes of our tupuna upon us, gentlemen, let's not let them down.
Yeah, I noticed, I will finish on this, I noticed that he had to pre-write all of that, right? Because he isn't confident enough in his position to just do it all off the top of his head. Or perhaps he wanted to narrow it down to ensure he could get that in that time frame. At the end of the day, I think the fact that he had to write it all down and base it off of that versus David Seymour, who knows absolutely everything he's going to say off the top of his head because he's debated it countless times, he has thought about it at length, I think that speaks volumes here, if nothing else. The fact that I can sit here, not being Mr. Helmut Modlik, and absolutely tear apart the illogical and baseless claim that he's making in something that's pre-written, I think that says a lot.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now we are in the revolving quick-fire question panel sibbing. David, the late, great Moana Jackson said, contrary to what the Crown has always said, the treaty did not admit either a cessation of Māori sovereignty or a vesting of power solely in a political system brought here from somewhere else. Rather, this is what he continues with, it suggested something that could be unique in this land, a constitutional framework which allowed for what the Waitangi Tribunal has called different spheres of influence, in which the will of Māori and the will of those who have come after 1840 could be expressed in a new and relational way. I put to you, Māori and those who came after 1840 have worked to find pragmatic ways of fulfilling the treaty. Why are you so ideologically driven to undermine that pragmatism with this referendum bill?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, it just doesn't work. It hasn't worked anywhere in the world. You know, if you can find an example where people are categorized by who their ancestors were or their ethnic background, and they have a role to play in society and a role to play in politics based on race, and that's been a success, I'd love you to point me to it, because I can point you to many examples where things like that have been tried and they've been a failure. In fact, most of the good people in history have worked towards equal rights, universal humanity. That is actually what New Zealand is based on and what we've signed up to in various international treaties for that matter. The second point is, have people pragmatically worked towards better ways to live together? Absolutely. And I'll give you an example of that. You know, there's one policy I have that the Iwi Chairs Forum has recently written to me and said, I agree with that. That's charter schools, or kura horua, to use the te reo Māori name. Now, I have absolutely no problem. In fact, I've put almost all the political capital I had, when I had nearly none, in allowing communities to set up schools. But here's the thing. It wasn't just a lot of iwi, it wasn't just a lot of Māori groups that wanted to run kura horua. We even included Willie Jackson, my old mate, ran a charter school. It was also Michael Jones Pacific Advanced Senior School. It was also Seta Salupia with Rise Up. It was also schools that actually didn't have any ethnic basis whatsoever. So if you want to be pragmatic and talk about how people can live their way and get on with it, that's fine. But if you want to talk about in fact, I'm one of the people that's done the most to try and make that happen. But if your idea is that actually somehow, you're going to have a separate health authority, you're going to have different voting rights, that you're going to be appointed to government panels, all based on who your ancestors were, I'm sorry, it's not worked anywhere and it's not going to work here.
Helmut, the late, great Professor Ranganui Walker said, "I have no time for the privileged people who take advantage of their privileged position to attack the weakest in society." What is really driving this anti-treaty agenda by this government, do you think?
Politics. So, look, with respect, if I could come back to the question that you just asked, David. So, you said we could have fun here, Bomber. So here we go.
Jump around, my friend.
Rip into it.
So look, the first and most important question is what in fact did Te Tiriti o Waitangi mean to the signatories in 1840, right? So I'd like to offer up briefly from 4 different perspectives inclusive evidence of what it meant to them, from both a logical point of view, from a linguistic point of view, from a cultural point of view, and a historical. Let's get the easy one out the way. The history, that's been written. That's done. I brought along the most recent book, which is a comprehensive analysis of all of the available pre, during, and post documentary evidence around it. And the conclusion was clearly, and here's what it says in that book: those who framed the English text, not just the Māori, intended Māori to have continuing rights to self-governance, which is what Tino Rangatiratanga means. Let's just put that aside. Second one, from a logical point of view, and I've mentioned this a few times, these islands were filled with over 100,000 fiercely independently people. Hobson comes along with Williams and Busby and manages to prevail upon them to surrender their mana, in effect, right? Just logically, I'd like someone, David, please, not right now, but please explain to me what.
Just tell me when.
Yeah, what was in fact said to those leaders, men and women, that enabled them to surrender that. The third observation I'd make, which is really important, which is cultural, right? Now, non-Maori New Zealanders may not understand this about Maori people from a traditional worldview point of view, but hopefully people will have heard of mana and mauri and ora. So in traditional Maori worldview, these ideas was how people viewed existence. And when you behaved in a mana diminishing way, it diminished your mana, your mauri, your ora. And ultimately, if you kept on persisting in mana diminishing behavior, it actually diminished your actual life. That's why when people lost in war, there wasn't any exaggerated bondage or imprisonment, because their mana had been so diminished, they accepted their change in circumstance.
You see what he actually just said there? He's just like, so in the Māori world, there was no slavery. Nothing like that, because what actually happened is that people's mana was diminished so much that when you lost the battle, if your entire family or yourself was then brought into slavery, it doesn't actually count as slavery because you're not worth shit because your mana's diminished. Okay.
The point being is the idea that the rangatira of 1840 would totally surrender their mana to a couple of blokes and some missionaries, it's preposterous, culturally and psychologically impossible. Now, we do need to get to the linguistic issue.
Now, what he needs to stop doing is just being so matter-of-fact. He says it's culturally and psychologically impossible, except we know it's not impossible because it's what actually happened. And in fact, you'll see what David Seymour says very shortly about just how unreasonable it is to say that this side it's just impossible that this side would have agreed to this happening, when the alternative is impossible for the other side. So it's one of those things where you just have to look at what did happen and then come to a general conclusion as to what the actual fact is. And we can't really say it's matter of fact one way or the other, apart from just interpreting the actual events that took place. And in this case, the events that took place do not really align with what Helmut here is saying.
Too, because this is really the black and white.
We're going to bring that up later. Damien, the late, not so great member of Parliament, James Richmond, wrote in 1851, "I look forward to the day when the preposterous Treaty of Waitangi will be overruled and the ridiculous claims of the natives to thousands of acres of untrodden bush and fern will no longer be able to dampen the ardour and cramp the energies of the industrious white man. How is that 19th century white settler privilege vibe any different from what ACT are proposing today? And aren't Māori sick of this?
No, I don't think you. If you go back and you have a look, and let's just talk about helmets, iwi, Ngāti Toa, there was a clear set of actions where the Crown and its the New Zealand Company in 1839 violated the property rights of Ngāti Toa. So I don't know the gentleman you are referring to, and I don't think his views hold much weight. But I want to come back to the issue of sovereignty. I'll ask David about that in a second. But in the case of helmets, iwi, you had property rights. The property rights were violated, and a treaty settlement was done. You can argue about whether the treaty settlement was fair or not. So I'm not too sure the point you're referring to, but I just want to ask David one question. The issue of sovereignty, do you believe that sovereignty was ceded in 1840?
Well, yes, I do. And just to reply to what Helmut's been saying, it may seem absurd that 100,000 Māori would cede sovereignty to a small group of people. But that is not to give those Māori some credit. They actually realised that they were dealing with the representatives of the only global superpower. And you can put it the other way
Preposterous.
around. Imagine for a moment, well, what's preposterous is the
No,
idea
literally
that...
let him finish on it.
Sorry.
What you could equally say it's preposterous that Queen Victoria, who was in charge of that superpower, arguably the most powerful woman in the world at the time, would enter into a partnership with 100,000 Māori on the other side of the world, when she certainly didn't consider herself to be in partnership with any other group. I think David Longy had a version of that was a bit more desultory that I won't repeat. And actually, you also got to remember at that time, Māori had experienced the musket wars, so self-governance wasn't going that well. In fact, more people died in the musket wars than New Zealanders died in World War I overseas. So, it's actually not preposterous. But ultimately, I also just make the point that it doesn't really matter, because what New Zealanders had since the Treaty of Waitangi, since 1852 when the first election was held, is 55 free and fair elections. You take out the first dozen because they didn't have women voting. I think it's shameful, but we got there before anyone else. We have had democracy of the likes that almost no other country can dream of. There's only 7 countries that have been democratic for as long as us. There are people all over the world who wish they had a government that was democratically elected the way that New Zealand is. That is the true legitimacy of Parliament today. That is the true legitimacy of the government today. People all over the world wish that they had that, and yet there are some people who want to look back 180 years into history and somehow run away from it.
How much can we get a response to that, please?
Please, look, so not for a moment do I actually want to denigrate in the slightest the value that's come to this land, in fact, the whole world of liberal democracy. Not for one second. That's a blessing to the world. So just park that.
Well, I think those chiefs valued it too.
The only point that I wanted to make, David, is that in fact the opportunity for that democracy to be here in the very first instance is because of the terms of the agreement reached between those chiefs and the representatives of the Queen's government that were here. Right? That's the only reason democracy is here. And so if truth first and justice, and in fact doing what you say, which is a fair go, which Kiwis are pretty hot on, mean anything in this land, then you can't just discard the basis for the democracy being here, because in the 21st century, it no longer suits our preferences. You've still got to deal with that constitutional origin and its reality. But I'd like to come back to the essential point. There is no evidence, not linguistic, not cultural, not historical at all, to the proposition that those chiefs ceded their mana motuhake.
False. I don't. You really don't. You just have to be that blunt. There's nothing more to say. They did cede sovereignty. They provided, or they granted, the authority of governance to the British Crown over all the lands of New Zealand, and sovereignty means the authority to govern over a state or another people, etc., etc., etc. That is what sovereignty is. Rejecting what sovereignty is does you no favors. If you want to try and cite, linguistics and reality and this, that, and the other thing, you have to be consistent. You can't just say, I reject what words mean because it doesn't affirm my worldview, whilst then arguing that someone else is rejecting the meaning of things, because that makes you a hypocrite. And this is just how it is every time. And now it looks like my X stream is down. What the hell?